Thanks very much, Michael. I'm slightly puzzled about the circumstances, and I can assure the audience that whatever they were not of the tribunal-inducing variety, so whatever else. Let me begin by just saying that parliaments are notoriously difficult to reform, that parliaments don't come in mail-order catalogues. They're shaped by their history, by the particular balance of power and the balance of competing interests. And membership of parliaments is almost by definition composed of people who are strong, opinionated, often cranky, but certainly people who are of an independent frame of mind. So getting agreement and getting change isn't all that easy. Secondly, most parliaments, in fact, virtually all parliaments, are dominated by party, either a single party or by a coalition. And parliamentary reform, in essence, asks the government to provide the opposition with additional means of attacking and scrutinising their policies and their actions. In contrast, opposition parties tend to be very eager advocates of reform, that is, until they themselves assume office, and it's been the general experience that when this happens, reform slips very far down the agenda, and they're far more understanding of the difficulties which their predecessors in office had to experience. So, reform, when it happens, when real reform comes, it generally comes as the result of a crisis. And we are in such a crisis now. As you've been hearing all week, and as the country has been hearing for the last year, all our institutions were cut short by the onset of the banking crisis. The Oireachtas was less spectacular and less damaging in its failures than most of the other major players, but nobody would claim that in its key areas of responsibility, its ability to spot, to analyse and debate the major changes that were taking place, both in our society and in our economy, that the Oireachtas even begun to debate these major issues. Its capacity to scrutinise government and public policy in a timely and informed way certainly was not particularly impressive. And its reactions to the cataclysmic events of 2008 were, maybe understandably, but they were slow, they were muddled, and it took some time for the Oireachtas to settle itself down. So a time like this offers very real possibilities for change. And as both Pat and Elaine made clear in their contributions, much of the agenda for reform has been around for a very long time. It can be said to have begun in 1966 with that group called Turin, to which we owe a great debt, and which is largely forgotten today, but a group which did begin to look in a very hard way at many of our major traditions and institutions. And it produced a pamphlet on Dáil reform in 1966, written by the late David Thornley, who later became a Labour TD, and the late John White, who was an outstanding scholar. But it set the agenda in 1966. And most of the reforms, and I'll deal with them in a few moments, most of the reforms can really be said to date from that time, and the agenda hasn't changed all that much. But I think it's important at the outset that I make 2 points. We can't ask the Oireachtas to do a job or to do things which are not part of its remit. And a lot of the discussion about what the Dáil or the Oireachtas should or should not do is based on false assumptions. It confuses the Oireachtas with the executive, which it isn't. And I think we just need to go back to basics. We only ask 5 main things from our Parliament. We ask it to provide us with stable government. We ask it to keep that government accountable and answerable. We ask it, in the public interest, to scrutinise proposals for the laws which will bind us all when they are enacted. We ask it to represent the legitimate interests of the people who elected its members. And the 5th thing we ask of it, and that is that it be a talking shop. People often dismiss Parliament as a mere talking shop. That misses the entire point of Parliament. The word Parliament comes from the word parley, to talk, to parley, where traditionally the various interests came together to talk about the common problems of their society. And one of the big failures of the Dáil and of the Seanad is that it doesn't talk enough, it doesn't talk in a meaningful, structured way about many of the deeper issues facing our society. Talk that in turn will inform legislation and behaviour. So, yes, to be a talking shop. We expect it to talk about the issues in a real, meaningful, and in some senses a prophetic way, trying to look ahead to what the issues are and will be. And certainly this sort of debate did not precede the banking crisis. Second thing I want to say in general terms is, before getting into the specifics of reform, by international standards, we have a good Parliament. This is not an opinion of mine. This is the view of much of the literature, on the comparative literature on parliaments worldwide, and in the rankings or the benchmarks provided by the International Parliamentary Union. So I think it's important to make that point. It is one of the oldest continuously surviving parliaments in the world. It has never failed in its first task of providing stable government. Its legitimacy has never been seriously challenged, and it has been honest in its conduct of public business. So in fairness too, it has to be said, ours is a parliament which has changed quite considerably in recent years. Television has opened up the Parliament to the public, so that for the first time, people who might never in their lives visit Parliament can now watch both the daily mundane events and the times of great drama, the change of government, the sackings, whenever major crises erupt. Now there is immediate access to the happenings of Parliament, and that is an enormous change which probably we take for granted. And as Pat indicated earlier, many of the procedures have changed, allowing for detailed questioning of the Taoiseach and ministers. And the committee system, and I'll talk about it in a moment, but for all its imperfections, it has been effective in many ways. Some of its public inquiries have changed the way we do business, or changed policy. The Dirt inquiry, the inquiry looking at the circumstances surrounding the fall of the Reynolds government, the Public Accounts Committee examination, bringing in of people, heads of departments, to explain why they overspent, to explain why they mismanaged public funds. Recently, in the banking crisis, the beginning of bringing in of many of the key players. And even this week, the publication by a committee of its report on the causes, well, the consequences of the flooding and so forth earlier this year, with a series of recommendations. So the committee system, I think, for all its imperfections, has worked. And it's not true to say that our Parliament hasn't changed. It has changed. Today, it is a well-resourced, well-housed Parliament. It has begun on the road to reform, but it's only begun. Moving to specifics, the biggest single failure of the Oireachtas lies in its failure to discharge its core responsibility to properly scrutinise legislation. To my mind, this failure is of scandalous proportions. Every year, dozens of bills, of Dáil bills, are guillotined. That is, they are rammed through the Dáil with no committee stage examination of many of the detailed proposals contained in the sections of the bill. I say this happens on a regular basis. Large parts of the finance bill, which can confer important, significant new powers on revenue and other bodies, large parts of it regularly are not debated in committee. Large sections of criminal justice legislation, often with implications for human rights, large sections again are guillotined through the Dáil. And it happened very recently, and do we ever learn? It happened on the Central Bank Bill. What this means, in a nutshell, is that major changes in the law are enacted without any, or certainly without full parliamentary scrutiny. And this is one of the few things we expect of our legislators. Why does it happen? To me, it happens for two reasons. It happens because the government controls the Dáil timetable, and it happens because it frequently suits the ministers and the civil servants responsible for the legislation. It works like this. At the beginning of every Dáil session, the order paper is light. We're told bills are going to be published, or they are published, but they lie on the order paper. And Pat said earlier about the fact that very often there isn't much time taken up with legislation. That's true, and true for the reasons he mentioned. But it's also true because the minister isn't ready to take it. The legislation lies there. And the session goes on, and suddenly you're about 2 weeks or a week from Christmas, a week from Easter, a week from the end of the session, and then the whip is informed that the minister or the department must have this bill through all stages by the end of that session, or the heavens will fall in. It will be a major crisis, and it must be done. And I remember when I was leader of the Senate, this would happen on a regular basis, that you'd be told the legislation had to be put through in a very short space of time. Civil Service Department would be onto you, treating you as if you were some sort of inconvenience on the way to legislation, to the enactment of their legislation. A sense that they had examined it in great detail. It didn't really need any changes. And this is something that happens on such a regular basis. It's no surprise, it's well documented. But to me, not to be outraged about it is to miss the whole significance of the central part of Parliament in legislation. It shows a profound lack of respect by government for one of the most fundamental aspects of the work in Parliament. But it also, to my mind, shows a fairly supine acceptance, take out the word fairly, a supine acceptance of this situation by opposition politicians who will engage in ritual protest, but don't really, I think, seem to have the sense of indignation which they should have as people who believe in the supremacy of Parliament. The second main area where the scrutiny of legislation is defective is in the imbalance of resources available to opposition vis-à-vis the government. Most legislation today, it's technical, it's detailed, it isn't always constructed in clear language. It's often difficult fully to understand it. Now, when the Minister is in and the legislation is being debated, the Minister will have an army of people around him who have lived, eaten, slept with that legislation in all of the previous months. I remember on occasions in the Shannon when the Finance Bill was on its annual visit, you could have up to 30 or 40 civil servants, some of whom I see here in the audience, waiting out in the ante-room, because each would have been responsible for one or two sections of the bill. But this is the range, rightly, of expertise that is available to the Minister. The opposition, for the most part, has to rely very often on outside help, volunteers, or on the resources of the overstretched research unit in Leinster House. It can be a very unequal battle, and there is a need to level the pitch, even if only somewhat. But the problem is also part of the opposition's own making. If a balance can be found between the resources which go into constituency work and into research, and resources go into each, with the balance very strongly in favouring constituency work over research, this is a choice which is open to the politicians themselves to make, because the Parliamentary Commission now, the Oireachtas Commission, runs the affairs of the Oireachtas. So this is something where, if the opposition really felt strongly enough on it, it is within their remit to do something about it. It is a test of TDs, in a way, of those TDs who tell us that scrutiny of legislation is really a major priority. Is it a bigger priority than constituency work? I don't think so. Now, let me, and I'm conscious of time, look at some of the other key areas of reform. The lengthy breaks, Pat mentioned them, and the short weeks top most of the popular lists. And it is not right that the Dáil is not in a position to hold the government accountable for such long, continuous periods each year, 3 full months at this time of the year, and especially when fairly crucial decisions are being made and events are happening. But there may be another point here. The wily Charles de Gaulle, he made it, in drawing up his constitution, made it illegal for Parliament to sit for more than 6 months a year on the basis that it would get in the way of government doing its job properly. And our own Bertie Ahern, when challenged about long breaks, and I quote, "Sure, how could we get anything done if we had to come in here every day?" Close quote. But there may be a point there. I think that governments do need certain freedom when they can get on, but not 3-month breaks. And I think this is simply a question of maybe sitting the same lengths of time, but reordering the year. The committee system in the Oireachtas, it's important to say that this is a learning process for Parliament. Some of our committees do first-class work, much of which goes unreported. Many produce very good reports, which attract little attention. Other committees at the present time don't make any real difference, have difficulty getting the numbers there. Members come in, sign out and go away, and the burden is carried by a small number of members. And my view is that we have a good committee system. We have far too many committees. We have 24 of them. I think half of that number, properly resourced and focused on core issues, would make a big difference. But I do think, on a positive note, that we are on the way towards having a good committee system, but change is needed. Now, there's been a lot of talk, and was mentioned by each of the previous speakers, about the electoral system, change in which seems to be held out as a panacea. I don't propose to enter the debate in detail here. I am an utter sceptic when it comes to changing the electoral system. I think, first of all, change is enormously difficult. It will require a constitutional amendment which will have to be led by the government. Now, the odds on any government persuading the people today to accept its advice on something that is in maybe its own self-interest, I think is very, very slow. And I think we could waste an awful lot of time if we could even get agreement on what sort of system we wanted. There's a great deal of talk about the list system, and I have to say I get a bit impatient with it. It tells us we can, through immaculate conception, bring in 6 or 8 experts into the Dáil. Well, the experts are there, they're called civil servants, and the government can buy in experts if it needs them, but bringing them in, this is going to improve our parliamentary system. In any event, I like my ministers to be elected. I like them to be close to the people. I don't want some university professor, actual or retired. I don't want, bankers, could I say, coming in as ministers straight off. And the British system, where it's on a regular basis, leaders of industry are made ministers, very few of them have been particularly successful. So there's no guarantee on the electoral system that a different system will produce a quote-unquote better type of TD. Countries are continuously experimenting with their electoral systems, and often to no great end. And, when I hear people like Professor Ed Walsh and so on talking of bringing in entrepreneurs, successful business people, doesn't talk about successful bankers anymore, successful business people to the Cabinet, I really become very, very concerned. There's a sort of a political illiteracy among many of the experts who comment on politics. Business skills and flair do not easily translate into political effectiveness. Michael O'Leary can close down 5 routes in the morning if they aren't performing. A government can't close down County Leitrim because it's underachieving or whatever it is. The sort of political skills that the so-called captains of industry have would cause chaos in politics. Because politics is about getting a balance, bringing people with you, trying to reconcile one interest group against the other. And it's largely about trying to bring people, not to go too far. And a lot of this talk of bringing in business people, I didn't mean to raise it here, but when I read in the Irish Times over the summer, some of the business people asked how to rescue the country. Generally, they were fairly threadbare, and very few ideas of any great consequence were floated. Now, the Seanad has been mentioned, and it's been spoken about very eloquently by Elaine. The best analysis of the Seanad is in the very good report which Mary O'Rourke chaired in 2004 or 5 on the future of the Seanad. And it said very simply that the Seanad had failed to carve out a distinctive role for itself in the legislative process, and it didn't have a satisfactory electoral system which would give maybe a good balance of representation within it. These are the two key problems. Now, we could go back to history and say that Mr De Valera, when he set up the Senate in 1937, said, "A bad Senate is better than no Senate." That was his view. He wasn't enthusiastic about it. He never wanted it to have any real power. So the Senate was never intended to be a powerful body, and it had an electoral system, based on a concept, vocational representation, which never really became a reality. But we could debate the abolition or reform of the Seanad at length. But it will only have a real role, first of all, if the government decides to take it seriously. And no government has ever taken seriously the question of a proper role, proper Seanad reform. It serves useful functions for every government, and there is no great pressure up to now for real reform. And secondly, if the Seanad itself, from within, shows real leadership. And I don't see any great signs of that around either. So unless these two things happen, the Seanad is going to wither on the vine. I would hate to see the Seanad abolished, but I accept that the status quo is not an option, that it must change or it will die. And I think the beginning of a major public debate on that is long overdue. Now, there are other areas, and I'm self-conscious, that need serious attention. One of them is how we deal with European legislation. We, in common with every parliament in Europe, has had to face that. There was somebody here on Monday, her name escapes me, but she produced, Lucinda Creighton, she produced a report last week on how the European Committee could really be strengthened, and I think it's the beginning of a process, but it is a huge deficit, and we've been working at it, and progress has been made, but it still remains. Now, I want to make two other points. When we talk about reform of the Oireachtas and to turn it into a legislature, there's a sort of a reality check. If TDs don't embrace the spirit of reform, then nothing really will change. And do TDs in their hearts want the sort of changes that will keep them tied down at committee work, will involve a great deal of extra research, will place demands on them, which are difficult demands, because researching legislation, reading it carefully, is hard work, or for which there is very little electoral reward. People who do that work don't get thanked at the ballot box, or will they take the view that the burden of constituency work, so-called, is more pleasurable, it's easier, and is ultimately far more rewarding than the committee work. And I'm making the point that we could fool ourselves and set up a very elaborate system, but if the TDs themselves don't embrace the spirit of it, then we won't have got very far. The last point I want to make is, how do we make all this happen? If, in a rather scattered way, I've outlined some of the areas of reform, and others have been touched in a more cogent way by my colleagues, but how do we actually make it happen? I think the first thing we need is public engagement, because there is a great deal of cynicism, criticism, distance in people's views of the Oireachtas. We just go through the radio, the blogging sites, the newspapers. There is a mood of disenchantment out there, fuelled maybe by the rows and scandals over expenses and by the general national malaise we're all experiencing at the present time. So it would be important to ignore the need for reform. We can't do it in a knee-jerk way, and we do need to have public engagement. I would suggest something on the model of the Forum for Europe. I believe that was a very successful exercise, with the wonderful Maurice Hayes taking the chair, meetings being held in all parts of the country, people invited along to give their views be listened to, their views on Europe, their fears, their maybe lack of understanding of what was happening. But I think it was a process which worked, because those who wanted to talk could go along. And I would suggest something similar on Parliament, that something which would go around the country in a structured, organised way, invite people to give their views, their suggestions, if they have any, on parliamentary reform. It's their parliament. On parliamentary reform, some of them will be good, others will be daft, but at least let's hear them, to move around the country and try to gather up support for, and it would be good as well for the humility of the Oireachtas to go out there and listen to what people have to say. The second point is that the reform process cannot be left to the politicians alone. If there is a body set up to coordinate parliamentary reform, as I believe there should be, then it should be chaired by an outside person. It should have external members on it, because if left to Parliament itself, it will not move very quickly. If there are elections or whatever, these will dictate and put delays in the way, but also for its credibility to have an independent external chair to try to move the process along. Parliaments will always be imperfect. More than most, they're the product of original sin. They have all the imperfections. And Parliament too will reflect. Again, sometimes there can be a little bit of talking down at people. Parliaments do reflect the sort of people that ordinary people elect. And people won't be told who they should elect, or who the proper people, or who shouldn't be a member of Parliament. That is the supreme right of the people. So Parliaments are imperfect, difficult, cussed bodies. But I believe that our Parliament does need significant, not fundamental, but significant changes to the way it does its business. I believe we have a real opportunity at this stage. I believe that many people in the public realise the urgency. I'm not sure that enough politicians do. And if there's any message from the MacGill Summer School, I think it might be to the politicians that this is a matter, one of many, but a matter of urgency. Thank you very much, and may I assure you I didn't wink once at Lisa Hand, Minister. Thanks very much.